Hi, John McElroy here, talking all things automotive. Today I'm talking with Laurie Harbour from Harbour Results. And Laurie, I love talking to you because you've got your hand on the pulse of the tool and die industry better than anybody I know out there. Unfortunately, every time I talk to you, it doesn't sound too good. What's the latest?
Well, it's an interesting time in the market, especially with all the discussion of tariff and trade. I mean, first of all, the automotive industry is down with vehicle launches, which is what affects our tool shops, right? So not seeing a lot of launches as they all kind of revisit their BEV strategy and their hybrid strategies. You've seen big delays in, T2XX, which you've talked a lot about, the F series and other programs. So that's put our tool shops in kind of limited demand.
Wait, let me stop there because I know I've talked about T2XX and you know what it means, but tell the audience what it means if they don't know.
Yeah, no. So the full size pickup trucks and SUVs for General Motors, frankly, for GM, Ford, and Dodge, were all supposed to come out in around the same time frame, 26, 27, 28. They've all delayed those backwards. So first was the GMC pickup trucks, the Silverado and the Sierra. And then last week or 2 weeks ago, they announced the delay of the full-size SUVs out of Arlington. Ford delayed the F-Series another 18 months. And so, a lot of changes going on with Ram and the extended range. So all those delays have impacted our tool makers because they're the biggest tool programs we have in the automotive industry. I mean, hundreds of millions of dollars worth of tooling that's just been pushed back. Some of it's sourced already, but now just put on, sort of a delay of 18 to 24 months.
And that's especially bad, right? Because these tool and die shops do not get paid until they actually deliver the tools, right? So they're sitting on stuff that they've put money into. An automaker delays a program, and now they're left holding the bag.
That's right. And they're asked to hold the capacity by the OEM. You still got to build the tools, and we tell you to build the tools. So it's hard for them to go fill that open capacity. So those, with those delays and just the change of the BEV strategies, the industry's been about a half the amount of demand it was back in 2018. We did $12 billion of tools 2018. We're going to do about 5.5 in 2025. So that really impacts our tool makers considerably.
So explain again for anybody who's watching, who's maybe not all that familiar with the tool and die industry, why is it so important?
Well, we can't make a part on a car without a stamping die or a die cast mold or a plastic injection mold, right? So and obviously not just the auto industry, but any market where we make a product, we need a tool. So the industry's been under threat from Southeast Asia for a long time, where they're doing tools at a lower price than what we do here. And they've stolen a lot of the market share. And so it's a very critical part of every new product, but very difficult to keep demand consistent for our tool makers. And they tend to be small family-owned shops, right? Independent owners. So it's a tough business to sustain if you don't have ongoing work.
Some people are going to say, well, we got 3D printing these days. Who needs tools? You just print it.
Yeah, unfortunately, you can't print at some of the volume that you see on a Chevy Silverado or a Sierra, right? And we've even seen 3D printing and tooling, but it's a very, very small bed size that I can print a tool or print a part. So we still need tool and die makers because we have very critical products to make for that auto industry.
Mm-hmm. And now, there's all this talk in Washington, putting tariffs on anything that's coming in, especially from Canada and Mexico, but it looks like it's going to go on everything. I've got to believe this is really hitting the tool and die industry.
Yeah, so some are very positive about those tariffs in the tool and die industry, right? So for example, to level set people, we have a 25% tariffs on dies and molds out of China today that was implemented by President Trump back in 2018. And those stayed in effect through the Biden administration. So every tool that comes in from China into the US has a 25% tariff on it.
Has that made a difference?
Not particularly. Unfortunately, the Chinese have just lowered their price 25% and are still stealing a lot of market share. And some would say, how do they do that? Well, they regulate things like steel purchases. They can set the price of steel. They, continue to pay very low labor, and they have a lot of investment from their government into these plants. They're buying their equipment for them. So low interest loans, things that make it easier to be a business owner there than maybe here in the US. So Now, in a couple weeks ago, he implemented 10% more tariff on China. So now it's a 35% tariff on tools. Still likely not going to have a huge impact, but it will have some depending on who the customer is. So our tool makers are happy about that. They want to see more tariff on China. Now, he also threatened 25% tariff on Canada and Mexico. Not so significant for Mexico on tooling. Certainly affects parts, but not tooling, because we don't make a lot of tools in Mexico. But Canada, we get $2 billion worth of injection molds for the automotive industry out of Windsor. So if we start to tariff Canada, I know it's been put on pause, but if we start to tariff tools, now you have an environment where we're at a much more of a price parity, right? Canada to the US for tools. So that tariff's going to impact Canada quite a bit. My concern is we've lost a lot of tool capacity. I'm not sure the US tool makers can take over making tools that we're making in Canada today.
So even if the tariffs forced stuff to be moved to the US, you're just saying the US tool and die industry just can't accommodate that right now.
Not in today's environment. I mean, we've lost about 4 very large mold builders in the last 2 years, like $60 million each in terms of total revenue tool makers. And the only ones that are left that are that big are in Windsor today. So it will affect the tool industry, or it will affect the automotive industry and where they buy tools.
So if the Trump administration called you and said, hey, Laurie Harbour, tool and die expert, what should we be doing with our tool and die industry in the US? What advice would you give them?
Well, I mean, obviously the challenge is to reinvest in our industry and rebuild this from both a labor standpoint and a equipment standpoint. The question is, how many people out there want to go out and start a tool and die business, right? Versus a production business where I make stamped parts or molded parts has a consistent flow to it. It's a very difficult business proposition today, but there are tool makers here in the US that are very good, that with the right people and with the right investment, it could be a very viable business. But we're always going to fight China. China's always going to be a player in taking that market share. So, frankly, personally, I'd like to see us work through the USMCA deal and come to an appropriate deal with Canada and Mexico as our partners in the business. I'd rather have it in Canada with some of the partnering that goes on between the US and Canada on tool making than to have it go to China.
Yeah. So what's your outlook? I mean, for the rest of this decade, let's say for the US tool and die industry. And by the way, I mean, I got to believe this has national security implications too. But what's your outlook?
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. We've been to Washington and done a lot of lobbying around national security, right? Every time we send over those 3D engineered diagrams to China, we are opening up the opportunity for, the security to go out the door with our parts and our pieces. And right now, the US government, and particularly the Department of Defense, is very interested in where can I make some of the tools and the parts I need to rebuild our defense industry. And we have to do that here in the US. So, but my outlook as we move into the next decade is it's going to be a very slow demand. Like I said, sort of half, 5 billion, 6 billion in demand between each year between now and the end of this decade. And some of that's because our automotive industry's got to sort out, are we going to launch all these new BEV products, or are we going to go back to ICE product or a hybrid, and to what trim levels and to what number of models are we going to do? You and I have talked a lot about all the trim levels and all the cost that goes into those things. The more we do, the more demand that is for tool and die, right? So I think it's going to be slow for the balance of the decade. And I think that those shops who are not prepared to be flexible and to manage their business right, we're going to see some more fallout in some of these, old school kind of tool and die makers who don't reinvent their business. A lot of them are going into production to help balance the ebbs and flows, right?
Yeah. Well, I think we all need to learn how to deal with the new reality of what's going on in the marketplace. But Laurie Harbour, thanks so much for your insights here. Always appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me.